When the radio crackled to life at 0347 hours that October morning, Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell knew her world was about to change forever. The voice on the other end was breaking protocol, speaking in hushed, desperate tones that cut through the static like a knife through silence. "Phoenix, we've got a nightmare scenario. 180 of our best are trapped behind enemy lines. Command says it's suicide to attempt extraction. They're writing them off." Sarah's hands gripped the radio so tight her knuckles went white. Behind her, the pre-dawn darkness of the airfield stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the distant hum of aircraft engines and the soft glow of runway lights. She had been preparing for a routine supply run, but routine had just died a violent death. In the military, there are rules. Chain of command. Orders that must be followed without question. But sometimes, Sarah thought as she stared at her helicopter sitting silent on the tarmac, there are things more important than rules. Sometimes, there are 180 reasons to break every order you've ever been given. What happens when a single pilot must choose between following orders and following her conscience? What drives someone to fly straight into certain death for people she's never met? This is the story of a decision that would echo through military history, a choice between safety and sacrifice, between protocol and humanity. The clock was ticking. The enemy was closing in. And Captain Sarah Mitchell was about to discover what she was truly made of. The desert wind howled across the makeshift forward operating base, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and fear. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been stationed at FOB Redemption for 8 months, long enough to know that when Colonel James Harrison called an emergency briefing at 4 in the morning, someone was about to have a very bad day. Sarah pulled on her flight suit with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after years of military service. At 32, she was one of the most experienced helicopter pilots in the entire theater, with over 3,000 flight hours and a reputation for getting people out of impossible situations. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been earned the hard way after she'd managed to crash land a damaged bird and walk away with all crew members intact. Like the mythical bird, she always seemed to rise from the ashes. The briefing room was packed when she arrived, filled with grim-faced officers studying satellite photos and tactical maps. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that comes before someone delivers news that will change everything. Sarah found a seat near the back, noting the presence of several high-ranking officials she didn't recognize. This wasn't a routine briefing. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the room, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. He was a career military man who had seen 3 tours in different conflict zones, but Sarah had never seen him look quite this shaken. Behind him, a large screen displayed aerial reconnaissance photos of a valley system deep in enemy territory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of command and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. At approximately 2,100 hours yesterday, Operation Silent Thunder went sideways in the worst possible way. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Operation Silent Thunder had been classified above her clearance level, but she knew it involved some of the military's most elite units. The kind of soldiers who specialized in missions that officially never happened. A joint task force of Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Special Operations Command personnel were conducting a high-priority extraction mission in the Kandahar mountain region. Harrison continued, clicking to the next slide. The image showed a satellite view of a remote valley surrounded by steep, rocky terrain. The mission was compromised. Enemy forces, in much larger numbers than anticipated, surrounded the extraction point. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning unit struggling against the desert heat. Sarah leaned forward, studying the terrain on the screen. It was nightmare fuel for any pilot: rugged mountains, narrow valleys, and limited landing zones. The kind of place where helicopters went to die. The task force managed to reach a defensive position here. Harrison pointed to a small clearing on the map, but they're completely cut off. We estimate they're facing at least 300 hostiles, with more arriving every hour. Our boys are outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. A hand went up from the front row. "Sir, what about close air support? Artillery? Surely we can provide some kind of assistance." Harrison's expression darkened. "The nearest artillery is 200 miles away. Air support would take 6 hours to reach the target, and by then, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the mathematics of warfare. 180 elite soldiers against overwhelming odds had a predictable outcome. Sir, another officer spoke up. What about extraction? We have birds capable of reaching that distance. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Harrison clicked to the next slide, showing weather patterns and threat assessments. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We're looking at near-zero visibility, wind speeds exceeding safe flight parameters, and confirmed surface-to-air missile installations along every approach route. Sarah studied the tactical display, her pilot's mind automatically calculating flight paths, fuel requirements, and risk factors. It was a suicide mission, no question about it. The mountains created natural choke points where aircraft would be sitting ducks. The weather would make flying nearly impossible. And the enemy had clearly prepared for exactly this scenario. Command has made its decision, Harrison announced, and the finality in his voice sent a chill through the room. Operation Silent Thunder is officially classified as a total loss. All extraction attempts are suspended indefinitely. The risk to additional personnel is deemed unacceptable. Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the gut. She understood military logic, understood the brutal calculus that sometimes required sacrificing the few to save the many. But understanding something and accepting it were two entirely different things. Sir, with all due respect, she found herself saying before she could stop herself, are you telling us we're abandoning 180 of our people? Every head in the room turned toward her. Harrison's eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of a laser sight. Captain Mitchell, I'm telling you that Command has evaluated all possible options and determined that any rescue attempt would result in additional casualties with minimal chance of success. Those men knew the risks when they accepted the mission. But, sir, the discussion is closed, Captain. Harrison's voice carried the kind of authority that ended conversations. All flight operations in that sector are suspended. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, is authorized to approach that area without direct orders from Theater Command. Is that understood? A chorus of yes, sir, filled the room, but Sarah's voice wasn't among them. She stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. The more she studied the terrain, the more she began to see patterns that others might have missed. There was a route, dangerous and requiring perfect timing, but a route nonetheless. The briefing continued with discussions of diplomatic efforts and potential prisoner exchange negotiations, but Sarah wasn't really listening anymore. Her attention was fixed on the topographical map, memorizing every ridge line, every valley, every potential landing zone. If she could approach from the northwest, using the weather as cover rather than fighting against it. If she could time her arrival with the dawn light to confuse enemy spotters, if she could. Captain Mitchell, Harrison's voice snapped her back to the present. The briefing room was emptying, officers filing out with the resigned expressions of people who had just witnessed something they would rather forget. A word, if you please. Sarah approached the front of the room where Harrison was gathering his materials. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of command that pressed down on every officer who had to make impossible decisions. I know what you're thinking, he said without looking up from his papers. Sir, you're thinking about flight paths and fuel loads and weather windows. You're thinking there might be a way. Now he did look up, and Sarah saw something in his expression that surprised her. It wasn't anger or disapproval. It was understanding, and maybe even a trace of hope. Sir, I've been studying those mountains for months. I know every thermal, every wind pattern, every, Sarah. The use of her first name stopped her cold. In all the time she'd served under Harrison, he had never broken protocol like that. I've been in command for 15 years. I've had to make decisions that haunt me every night. But this one, he shook his head. This one might be the decision that breaks me. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 180 lives hanging between them like a physical presence. If someone were to ignore my direct orders, Harrison said slowly, carefully, if someone were to take it upon themselves to attempt an unauthorized mission, they would be facing court-martial, the end of their career, and potentially years in military prison. Sarah nodded. I understand, sir. On the other hand, Harrison continued, If that same someone were to succeed against all odds, if they were to bring our people home. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She understood what Harrison was really saying. He couldn't order her to attempt the mission that was officially impossible, that would violate every regulation and put even more lives at risk. But he also couldn't bring himself to completely close the door on the possibility that someone might try anyway. Sir, I should return to my quarters and get some rest before my scheduled supply run tomorrow. Yes, Harrison agreed. You should definitely get some rest. And Captain, that supply run has been canceled. Your bird is scheduled for maintenance beginning at 0800 hours. Sarah felt a spark of hope. If her helicopter was officially in maintenance, then, technically, it wouldn't exist on any flight schedules. If someone were to take it for an unauthorized flight, it might be hours before anyone noticed it was missing. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spread the topographical maps across her small desk, the papers rustling in the pre-dawn silence of her quarters. She had managed to acquire the classified terrain maps through Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, an intelligence analyst who owed her a favor from when she'd evacuated his wounded brother from a hot landing zone 6 months earlier. The debt was paid now, but at considerable risk to both of them. The maps revealed details that the briefing slides had missed. Hidden valleys, seasonal water sources, and, most importantly, a narrow canyon approach that enemy forces might not expect simply because it was so dangerous that no sane pilot would attempt it. The passage was barely wide enough for her helicopter, with wind shears that could slam an aircraft into the canyon walls without warning. But it also offered something invaluable: cover from surface-to-air missiles and a direct route to the trapped soldiers. Sarah traced the potential flight path with her finger, calculating distances and fuel requirements with the precision that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. The round trip would push her aircraft to its absolute limits, leaving virtually no fuel for contingencies or extended hovering time during extraction. She would have one chance to land, load the soldiers, and get out. If anything went wrong, if the landing zone was too hot, or if enemy fire damaged her aircraft, they would all die together in those mountains. A soft knock on her door interrupted her planning. Sarah quickly covered the maps with a maintenance manual and checked her watch. 0627 hours. Who would be visiting her quarters at this time of morning? Come in, she called, keeping her voice casual. The door opened to reveal Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, her crew chief and door gunner. Jenny was a 26-year-old mechanic from Detroit who could fix any helicopter problem with whatever tools happened to be available. More importantly, she was one of the few people Sarah trusted completely. Ma'am, I know it's early, but I wanted to talk to you about the maintenance schedule for our bird. Jenny's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind her. What about it, Sergeant? Jenny moved closer to the desk, noting the hastily concealed maps. Ma'am, I've been working on helicopters for 8 years, and I've never seen a maintenance request quite like the one that came through last night. Routine inspection and minor repairs, estimated duration 6 to 8 hours, but no specific work orders attached. Almost like someone wanted the bird officially grounded, but actually flight-ready. Sarah studied her crew chief's face, seeing intelligence and understanding there. Jenny had been with her for over a year, had flown through enemy fire and impossible weather conditions, and had never once questioned Sarah's judgment or decisions. If anyone could be trusted with what Sarah was contemplating, it was Jenny Walsh. Hypothetically speaking, Sarah said carefully, if someone were to discover that our helicopter was actually in perfect working condition, what would that person's obligations be? Hypothetically, ma'am, that person would be required to report the discrepancy to their commanding officer. Jenny paused, her expression thoughtful. Unless, of course, that person had reason to believe the discrepancy was intentional and served a greater purpose. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her crew chief's quick thinking. And what greater purpose might justify such a discrepancy? Bringing our people home, ma'am. Always bringing our people home. Without another word, Sarah pulled away the maintenance manual and revealed the maps spread across her desk. Jenny's eyes widened as she took in the classified materials and the carefully plotted flight path leading deep into enemy territory. Ma'am, this is the valley where our boys are trapped. 180 of them, Jenny. Cut off, surrounded, and running out of time. Sarah pointed to the defensive position marked on the map. Command has written them off. No official rescue attempts will be made. Jenny studied the maps with the eye of someone who understood both aircraft capabilities and tactical situations. This approach route through the canyon, it's insane. Wind shears alone could kill us before we even reach the LZ. I know. Surface-to-air missiles positioned here and here. Jenny continued, pointing to marked enemy positions. Even if we make it through the canyon, we'll be exposed during the final approach. I know that too. Jenny was quiet for a long moment, her finger tracing the route Sarah had planned. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. When do we leave? Sarah felt a wave of emotion that she quickly suppressed. She had hoped Jenny would volunteer, but she had also been prepared to make the flight alone if necessary. Having her experienced crew chief along would dramatically improve their chances of success. We need to be airborne in 90 minutes, Sarah explained. That gives us a departure window while the base is at minimal staffing and an arrival window that coordinates with dawn in the target area. The changing light should confuse enemy spotters and give us our best chance of approaching undetected. Jenny nodded. I'll need 30 minutes to prep the bird. Full fuel load, maximum ammunition for the door guns, and I'll want to strip out any non-essential equipment to save weight for the soldiers we're bringing back. Jenny, you understand what we're risking here? This isn't just our careers or court-martial. If this goes wrong, if we get shot down or captured, ma'am, Jenny interrupted, I had a brother in the Rangers. Lost him in Afghanistan 3 years ago because his extraction was delayed by bad weather. Every night since then, I've wondered what would have happened if someone had been willing to take the risk, to ignore the odds, and fly into that storm anyway. She met Sarah's eyes directly. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life wondering about these 180 soldiers. Sarah felt a surge of respect for her crew chief that went beyond their military relationship. Jenny Walsh was risking everything based on principle, based on the belief that some things were more important than following orders or protecting your own safety. It was the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any military academy. There's one more thing, Sarah said, pulling out a sealed envelope. If this mission goes sideways, if we don't make it back, I want you to know that I take full responsibility. I've prepared a letter explaining that I coerced you into participating, that you were following my direct orders, and had no choice in the matter. Jenny took the envelope and immediately tore it in half. We're partners in this, ma'am. Equal responsibility, equal risk, equal commitment to bringing our people home. She dropped the torn pieces into Sarah's wastebasket. Now let's go steal a helicopter. The next hour passed in a blur of careful preparation. Jenny worked on the aircraft while Sarah finalized their flight plan and gathered emergency supplies. The hardest part was maintaining the appearance of normal routine while conducting what amounted to the most important mission of their lives. They spoke in low voices, communicated with hand signals when other personnel were nearby, and tried to look like 2 crew members conducting routine maintenance rather than 2 soldiers preparing to violate direct orders and fly into enemy territory. At 0743 hours, Sarah performed her final pre-flight inspection. The helicopter was in perfect condition, fully fueled and armed, with every system functioning optimally. Jenny had managed to create additional space in the cargo compartment by removing seats and equipment, maximizing their capacity to evacuate soldiers. If everything went perfectly, they could extract 30 to 40 personnel on each flight. It would require 5 or 6 trips to save everyone, assuming they survived the first one. As Sarah started the engines, she tried not to think about the mathematical improbability of what they were attempting. The odds against successfully completing even one extraction flight were astronomical. The odds against completing multiple flights were beyond calculation. But mathematics had never been the determining factor in rescue missions. What mattered was commitment, skill, and the refusal to accept that good soldiers should die simply because saving them was difficult. The helicopter lifted off at exactly 0800 hours, rising into the pale morning sky with the smooth efficiency that came from years of experience and perfectly maintained equipment. From the outside, it would appear to be a routine departure, perhaps a supply run or transport mission. Only Sarah and Ginny knew that they were embarking on a flight that would either save 180 lives or add 2 more names to the casualty lists. As they gained altitude and turned toward the mountains, Sarah thought about Colonel Harrison. By now, he would have discovered that his orders had been disobeyed, that 2 of his personnel had taken it upon themselves to attempt the impossible. She wondered if he would be angry or proud, if he would immediately launch a search and rescue mission to bring them back, or if he would simply wait to see what happened. The radio crackled to life as they approached the edge of their normal operating area. Phoenix 7-7, this is base control. Please confirm your destination and mission parameters. Sarah and Ginny exchanged glances. This was the moment of no return. Once they continued past this point, they would be officially AWOL, in violation of direct orders, and committed to a course of action that would end either in triumph or disaster. Base control, Phoenix 7-7 is conducting routine patrol operations in Grid Section 7 Alpha. The lie came smoothly, automatically. Grid Section 7 Alpha was in completely the opposite direction from where they were actually heading. Copy, Phoenix 7-7. Maintain radio contact and report any unusual activity. Understood, base control. Phoenix 7-7 out. Sarah switched off the radio and looked at Ginny. Last chance to change your mind. We can still turn back, claim engine trouble, and no one will ever know what we almost did. Ginny checked her weapons systems and adjusted her headset. Ma'am, the mountains rose before them like ancient sentinels, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised nothing but trouble. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she guided the helicopter toward the narrow canyon that would either be their salvation or their tomb. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as they encountered the first of the mountain wind currents, invisible rivers of air that could grab a helicopter and dash it against the rocks without warning. Ma'am, I'm picking up radio chatter on enemy frequencies, Ginny reported, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored multiple communication channels. Sounds like they've got patrols spread throughout these mountains. They're definitely expecting some kind of rescue attempt. Sarah wasn't surprised. The enemy wasn't stupid. They had to know that 180 elite soldiers represented a significant intelligence asset. They would be prepared for extraction attempts, which meant Sarah and Ginny were flying into what amounted to a carefully prepared trap. Range to target? Sarah asked, fighting to keep the helicopter stable as another wind shear tried to slam them into the canyon wall. 43 minutes at current speed, assuming we don't have to detour around weather or enemy positions. Ginny paused, studying her instruments. Ma'am, I'm seeing some concerning readings on the fuel consumption. These headwinds and the altitude are eating through our reserves faster than calculated. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Fuel management was the difference between a successful mission and becoming a permanent addition to the mountainside. She had built the flight plan with razor-thin margins, and now those margins were disappearing into the thin mountain air. The canyon walls closed in around them as they entered the most dangerous part of the approach route. Here, the passage was barely wide enough for their rotor diameter, with sheer rock faces rising hundreds of feet on both sides. If they encountered enemy fire in this confined space, there would be nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to escape. They would be trapped like a bird in a cage. Contact, Ginny reported suddenly, her voice sharp with alarm. Surface radar painting us from bearing 270. They know we're here. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, dropping the helicopter to minimum altitude and increasing speed. The canyon floor rushed past beneath them at terrifying velocity, rocks and sparse vegetation blurring together as they raced toward their destination. Behind them, she could hear the whine of surface-to-air missiles being activated, enemy forces scrambling to engage the unexpected intruder. Multiple missile locks, Ginny announced, her calm professionalism a stark contrast to the deadly situation they faced. Recommend immediate evasive action. Sarah banked hard left, then right, using the canyon walls themselves as cover from the missile guidance systems. The helicopter groaned under the stress of the high-G maneuvers, metal and machinery pushed to their absolute limits. Through her headphones, she could hear Ginny working frantically with electronic countermeasures, trying to confuse the enemy targeting systems. The first missile streaked overhead, close enough that Sarah could feel the heat from its exhaust. It impacted against the canyon wall in a shower of rock and flame, the explosion echoing off the mountains like thunder. The second missile passed beneath them, detonating harmlessly against the canyon floor, but filling the air with shrapnel and debris. That was too close, Jenny muttered. But her hands never stopped working as she prepared the door guns for what was certainly coming next. They burst out of the canyon into a wider valley system, and Sarah immediately saw why the trapped soldiers hadn't been able to escape on their own. The valley was a natural fortress, surrounded by steep ridges that provided perfect cover for enemy positions. She could see muzzle flashes from dozens of weapons, a deadly constellation of gunfire directed at the small clearing where the soldiers had made their stand. There, Jenny pointed to a cluster of rocks near the center of the valley. That's got to be our boys. Sarah could see them now, 180 of the military's elite fighters pressed into a defensive perimeter that seemed impossibly small from the air. They were taking fire from three sides, using whatever cover they could find to return fire against overwhelming odds. Several figures weren't moving, casualties of a battle that had been raging for hours. The landing zone was a nightmare scenario. It was under constant enemy fire, surrounded by hostile positions, and barely large enough for a helicopter to set down. Worse, approaching it would require flying through a gauntlet of ground fire that would turn their aircraft into scrap metal in seconds. "Ma'am, there's no way to land in that clearing without taking massive fire," Jenny observed, her tactical mind processing the situation. "We need to suppress those enemy positions first." Sarah studied the terrain, her pilot's instincts searching for any advantage they could exploit. Then, she saw a ridge line to the east that would provide cover for an indirect approach. If they could use the terrain to mask their approach, if they could coordinate with the soldiers on the ground to provide suppressive fire. "Jenny, get on the emergency frequency. See if you can raise our boys down there." Jenny switched radio channels and began transmitting. Any station, this is Phoenix 77 inbound for emergency extraction. Please respond." Static filled the airwaves for what seemed like an eternity. Then, cutting through the interference, came a voice that was strained but unmistakably American. "Phoenix 77, this is Ground Team Alpha. We see you up there, and we sure are glad you came to the party. Be advised, LZ is extremely hot. Multiple enemy positions with heavy weapons." Sarah keyed her microphone. "Ground Team Alpha, Phoenix 77. We're going to try an indirect approach from the East Ridge. Can you provide suppressing fire on the southern positions when we make our run?" "Affirmative, Phoenix. We've been saving some special ammunition for just this occasion. Give us 30 seconds to coordinate, then make your run." Sarah used the time to position the helicopter for their approach, staying low and using the mountainous terrain to mask their movement from enemy observers. The fuel gauge continued its relentless countdown, each minute bringing them closer to the point where they wouldn't have enough fuel to make it home. But, right now, home seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford to think about. "Phoenix 77, Ground Team Alpha. We are ready on your signal." Sarah took a deep breath and pushed the helicopter into a steep dive toward the landing zone. "Execute, execute, execute." The response was immediate and devastating. The trapped soldiers unleashed every weapon they had, creating a wall of suppressing fire that forced the enemy positions to take cover. Explosions bloomed across the mountainside as grenades and rocket-propelled munitions found their targets. For the first time in hours, the soldiers weren't just defending, they were attacking. Sarah dove the helicopter through the chaos, weaving between tracer rounds and explosions as Jenny returned fire with the door guns. The landing zone rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed, and Sarah had to make split-second adjustments to avoid the scattered equipment and casualties that marked the soldiers' defensive perimeter. The helicopter touched down hard, the landing skids striking the rocky ground with enough force to jar every rivet in the aircraft. Immediately, soldiers began sprinting toward them, carrying wounded comrades and laying down covering fire as they moved. Sarah kept the engines running, knowing that every second on the ground made them a larger target for enemy mortars and rocket fire. "Load 'em up," Jenny shouted over the roar of the engines and the crack of gunfire. She had moved to the cabin door, helping wounded soldiers aboard while maintaining fire on enemy positions with her sidearm. Sarah watched in amazement as the soldiers moved with clockwork precision despite their desperate circumstances. The most seriously wounded were loaded first, followed by those who could no longer fight effectively. The soldiers who remained capable of combat continued to provide covering fire, ensuring that their comrades could reach safety before thinking of their own escape. "That's 32 aboard," Jenny reported. "Maximum safe capacity." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Ground Team Alpha, Phoenix 77 departing with first load. We'll return for additional personnel. Hold your positions." "Roger, Phoenix. We'll keep the lights on for you." The helicopter lifted off under heavy fire, climbing rapidly toward the safety of altitude and distance. Behind them, the remaining soldiers continued their desperate defense, holding a perimeter that seemed to shrink with every passing minute. Sarah looked at the fuel gauge and felt her heart sink. They had enough fuel to reach friendly territory with the current load, but returning for additional soldiers would push their reserves beyond safe limits. As they climbed toward the canyon exit, Jenny was already working on medical triage for the wounded soldiers they had rescued. Several were in critical condition, requiring immediate medical attention that she was providing with the limited supplies available. The cabin was filled with the groans of injured men and the smell of blood and gunpowder. "Ma'am," one of the rescued soldiers called out over the engine noise. He was a sergeant with a bandaged head wound and the steady eyes of someone who had seen too much combat. "I don't know who authorized this mission, but I want you to know what you did back there. You saved lives today." Sarah found herself thinking about the 148 soldiers still trapped in that valley, still fighting against impossible odds while she flew away to safety. The mathematics of rescue operations were brutal and unforgiving. She could save 30 or 40 soldiers per trip, but each trip consumed fuel and increased the risk that weather or enemy action would end their rescue efforts permanently. "Jenny, what's our fuel situation for a second run?" Her crew chief looked up from a wounded soldier she was treating. "Cutting it very close, ma'am. We'll be flying on fumes for the return trip." Sarah stared ahead at the canyon exit that would take them back to safety, then looked back toward the valley where their fellow soldiers continued to fight and die. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to deliver their current passengers to medical care and wait for official rescue operations to be authorized. But official rescue operations might take hours or days, and the soldiers in that valley didn't have hours or days. "Jenny, prep for immediate turnaround once we reach friendly airspace. We're going back." "Ma'am, the fuel situation, I know the fuel situation. We're going back anyway." Jenny nodded, understanding that some decisions transcended safe flying practices or military regulations. "Roger that, ma'am. I'll have the bird ready for immediate relaunch." Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed off the mountains, a reminder that 148 soldiers were still fighting for their lives in a valley that the world had written off as a total loss. Sarah Mitchell had saved 32 lives, but her work was far from finished. The most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead, where fuel margins would be non-existent and enemy forces would be fully alert to their presence. The helicopter raced towards safety through the mountain canyon, carrying its precious cargo of rescued soldiers toward medical care and survival. But Sarah's mind was already focused on the return trip, calculating flight paths and fuel consumption for a mission that everyone would say was impossible. She had proven them wrong once. Now she had to prove them wrong again, and again, until every last soldier was brought home or her helicopter became another casualty of war. With all due respect, those boys in the mountains don't have the luxury of changing their minds. Let's go bring them home. Sarah pushed the helicopter's speed to maximum, racing toward the mountains that rose like jagged teeth on the horizon. Behind them, the forward operating base grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it their safety, their careers, and their connection to everything they had known. Ahead lay enemy territory, impossible odds, and 180 soldiers who had no idea that help was coming. The first part of their flight passed over relatively safe terrain, barren desert punctuated by small villages and the occasional patrol. But as they approached the foothills of the mountain range, the landscape began to change. The terrain became rougher, more vertical, with hidden valleys and steep ridges that could conceal enemy positions. This was where the real danger would begin, where every mile would take them deeper into hostile territory with no possibility of support or backup. Sarah began to understand why Command had declared the mission impossible. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead, a maze of canyons and peaks that seemed designed to swallow aircraft and never give them back. Weather was beginning to move in from the north, bringing the low visibility and dangerous winds that had been predicted. In another few hours, flying conditions would deteriorate from difficult to impossible. But they were committed now, racing against time and weather and enemy forces to reach soldiers who were counting on someone to care enough to try. Sarah Mitchell had made her choice, and there was no turning back. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah's mind was already working through the logistics. She would need to modify her flight plan, calculate fuel loads for a much longer journey, and somehow acquire military maps that were above her clearance level. Most importantly, she would need to find a way to reach 180 trapped soldiers without getting herself and her crew killed in the process. The desert night was beginning to give way to the faintest hint of dawn as Sarah reached her quarters. She had perhaps 4 hours before the base would be fully awake, and her window of opportunity would close forever. For hours to plan a mission that every expert had deemed impossible. For hours to figure out how to save the lives of soldiers she had never met but who were depending on someone, anyone, to care enough to try. She sat on her bunk and pulled out a notebook, beginning to sketch flight paths and calculate fuel requirements. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors, the eternal rhythm of a forward operating base that never truly slept. Somewhere out there, 180 of the military's best were fighting for their lives, believing that help would come because help always came. That was the promise, spoken and unspoken, that bound military units together. No one gets left behind. Sarah looked at her watch. 3 hours and 47 minutes until her helicopter was officially scheduled for maintenance. 3 hours and 47 minutes to decide whether she was going to follow orders and live with the consequences, or break every rule she had ever sworn to uphold for the chance to bring her people home. The choice, she realized, had already been made. Now all that remained was the planning, and then the flying, and then whatever happened when she flew straight into the most dangerous airspace in the entire theater of operations. Sarah Mitchell began to write, her pen moving steadily across the paper as she planned her own personal war against impossible odds.